Hello, we're going to be talking about the Sam Student Handout for MLA style, and I am going to pull up the Sam Student Handout. This information is going to be divided into more than one recording because the information is just so lengthy. So I'm going to start at the beginning of the Sam Student Handout and go to the end, and I'll pause at some point during the course of this particular recording, and then I'll continue and pick up with another area. So I'm going to upload and share with you the Sam Student Handout, which is an MLA guide, and it's available to you separately from this recording. You can access the Sam Student Handout in Blackboard. So you have a copy of it. You can download it to your computer. You can print it, whatever you would prefer to do. You have access to it to do that with. And so we're going to start with what the Sam Student Handout is and what MLA style is, just a little bit generally. MLA stands for the Modern Languages Association, and their handbook is the handbook that you use for English 101. The MLA sets guidelines for how to give credit to sources when you use sources in your papers. And so in English 101, for example, the argumentation paper and the literary analysis paper require that you document the sources that you used. So this is just an overview and review of MLA style, some reminders about how to give proper credit for material that you borrow, and also how to set up an essay in MLA style. And again, you can access this information separately as the handout itself and just print out the handout. So there are some general guidelines here that apply to all papers and that appear in other places in this course. So these are just reminders that you do need to, for example, double space, use 1-inch margins, Times New Roman 12-point font, and indent each new paragraph a 1/2 inch, just the first line. Put in a header that includes your last name and page number, and then format the titles of long literary works in italics and short literary works in quotation marks. And long literary works are those that are long enough to stand alone, like books, plays. Short literary works are things like magazine or journal articles, online articles, short stories, brief poems, not ones that are book length. And then formatting the first page. In an MLA essay, you don't include a separate title page. So the first page of the essay is the first page of the essay itself. Now, if you have an essay that requires an outline, which in English 101 an outline is required for the argumentation and literary analysis papers, if you have an outline, then that should be the beginning of your file. But you're not supposed to put a page number on the outline. And then the first page of the essay is page 1. And then the works cited page becomes the last page of the essay. So for example, if your last paragraph of your essay ends on page 3, your works cited would become page 4. On the next page, there's a sample of how the first page of an essay would look, not the outline, of course, but the actual first page of the essay. In the upper right-hand corner, you put your last name, a space, and the page number. Let Word automatically put in the page numbering. If you type in a number, that same number will appear on every page of your file. And then on the left side, you have what's called the heading, which includes your identifying information, the identifying information for the course as well. And then you need the title of your essay, and then begin the essay. And notice the first line of the essay is indented a 1/2 inch from the left margin. And the first line of each following paragraph would also be indented that way. So The works cited page is one of the key elements for a documented essay. And anything that requires you to use sources, you have to give credit to those sources. So you have to list them. And a works cited is how MLA goes about doing that. So when you put things in your works cited, you have to follow certain rules. There's a format that you use. That format is different for, say, MLA, which we use for English courses, and other documentation styles like APA, which is sometimes used in education courses or science, psychology courses. So MLA uses parenthetical citations, and it uses a works cited list at the end of the paper. When you're putting titles in your works cited, titles of articles or websites or books, you need to put those titles in the right form, capitalize the title. When you're capitalizing a title, you capitalize the first word, the last word, and all what I call important words, which means nouns, adverbs, verbs, adjectives. What don't you capitalize? You don't capitalize the words a, an, and the. Those are called articles, and they're only capitalized if they begin or end a title. The same rule applies to short conjunctions like and or. Those are only capitalized if they begin or end a title. Prepositions also are not capitalized unless they start or end a title. So prepositions are like of and to. So watch those rules when capitalizing. Sometimes in the sample formats that you might pull off the internet, the capitalization of titles may not be correct. Short stories and journal articles and website articles are formatted in quotation marks. So when you put the name of the section or article you used from a source, you put that in quotation marks. You italicize the names of longer literary works. So that means things like books or epic poems like Beowulf. Check the positioning of punctuation. You want to make sure that you have your periods and commas in your works cited in the right place. They're placed inside the quotation marks that surround a title, not outside. Don't put two periods, one before the quotation marks and one after. And don't put double quotation marks inside other double quotation marks. So for example, if the title of an article has the title of a poem in it, you would put single marks around the title of a poem and double marks around the title of the whole article. Take the hyperlinks out that in your works cited. The hyperlinks are the blue that you have marked in when you have a URL put into something. So to get rid of that blue hyperlink, you can hover your mouse over it and then right click, and usually one of the options will be remove hyperlink, and that should take off the underlining and that should turn the blue font black. You want the font to be black and you don't want the URL to be underlined. Don't number sources in your works cited and don't bullet point them. So you're just going to list the sources on your works cited in alphabetical order, and we're going to talk about how you do that. Double space the entire works cited. Microsoft Word adds 8 points vertically between paragraphs. So if you don't take that 8 points extra out before you start typing your works cited, you're going to have too much space between the source entries, and you don't want to do that. If one author wrote more than one of your sources, there is a method for giving credit to that author. The second time you use the person's name, you don't type the person's complete name. You actually just put 3 hyphens or em dashes and in place of the person's last name or person's name, actually. So for online sources, type the source URL exactly the way that it appears in the search bar where you initially access the source. So you don't have to include the http:// in the source entry. You can copy right out of the search bar. You can copy the URL where you got the article, but you may need to change the size of the font, the style of the font, the indenting, spacing when you paste that URL into your works cited. Be sure you format it in Times New Roman 12. I mentioned about the extra 8 points of spacing. Double space the entire works cited page. Most sources you list on your works cited have entries that are more than one line, especially online sources because they have URLs with them. So in a works cited, you do what's called reverse indenting, and we're going to get to that later on in this handout, but that means that you bring the first line back to the margin and you indent all the lines other than the first line of a source entry. Now, in a paragraph, you do just the opposite to what you do in a works cited. This rule, don't break a URL apart, even if the line breaks appear uneven. Accuracy is more important than appearance. So when you're talking about URLs, when you paste a URL in, let it break itself however it needs to, or not break itself. But don't space or move the address apart, the URL address apart. Let it format itself. Use MLA date format. There's an example here of that. You use MLA date format in your heading when you first start your paper, but you also need to use it in your works cited source entries when you are listing when things were published or when they were posted online. So to do that, you put the day of the month first, then the month, then the year. Notice there's no comma in that. So you don't do it the way traditionally we're accustomed to, where you put the month, day, a comma, and then a year. And if you have a month of more than 4 letters, you abbreviate it. MLA has its own abbreviations for the various months, which are the standard abbreviations for them. And I gave you some examples of those. If you would like, I would prefer that you add an access date at the end of your source entries. An access date tells when you located the information online. And you just put the word accessed followed by the date. There's a sample here of how that would look at the end of your works cited source entry. Not every instructor requires that access date, but some do. So it doesn't hurt to put the access date. If your source doesn't have a credited author, start with the name of the article. And that applies if it doesn't have a credited author or editor. Sometimes a source has an editor listed, but not an author. So sources that don't have an editor or an author, you start with the name of the article that you used. And those are most common for online sources because online, sometimes you don't have someone who's given credit for a particular article. If a literary work stands alone, like a play or an epic poem, italicize both the title of the work and the title of the anthology or book in which it is located. So for example, if you had a copy of Shakespeare's play Hamlet, and that play was in a larger book that was a collection of Shakespeare's plays, you would italicize both Hamlet and the name of the full book that had all the plays in it when you put those on the works cited. Don't use quotation marks and italics to mark the same title. It's either a brief work or it's a standalone work, so don't mix those up. In other words, you can't take the name of a play like Romeo and Juliet and format it in both italics and quotation marks. It's a standalone work that can be a book by itself, so it's formatted in italics. If you have a long URL, and this is a long URL here, one that is more than 3 lines, you're permitted to do what's called truncating, which means shortening. So you can shorten the URL and stop after just the host. So if you shortened this particular work, the URL, you would stop after this slash, the second slash. And so here's an example of that. And you don't have to have that slash, just that first slash and then the next letters. If you use a book with more than one author, when you list the book on your works cited, you're going to have to give credit to all the authors. So there's an example of how to do that on here. So let's say you had 3 authors. I made an example based on if 3 of us in the English department wrote an article together. Here would be an example of that. The first person's name is put in reverse order, last name, comma, first name. And then the other authors' names are put in normal order. If you have just 2 authors, the same rule applies. The first person's name is last comma first, and then everyone else, which would just be one other person, is in normal order. Notice there is a comma after the name of each author, except, of course, the last one. Sometimes in doing papers, you might have a government agency, a company, or a college that is both the author of its website and the sponsor of its website. If that's the case, if it's the publisher and or sponsor and the author, for example, Wallace State is the author of the Wallace State website. So you don't need to put that twice. What you can do is start with the title of the article you used or the section you used from the website, and then name the website, then list the sponsor or publisher, and then continue on with the other information about the source. If an article from a website doesn't have a specific date, let's say you're looking at a section of a website, it does not have a specific date just for that section. So use the date the website was most recently updated. You can usually find that date by scrolling to the bottom of the homepage of the site. Before you turn in an essay, check to see that all your sources match. This is something your instructor is going to do. I'm going to check to see if you have a parenthetical citation to a source in your paper, then I'm going to look to make sure that source is listed on your works cited and that the 2 sources match clearly. If you have a source listed on your works cited, I'm going to check to see, is that source parenthetically cited in your paper? So for example, if you have a source used in your paper and it's by someone whose last name is Rodriguez, and you use it in your paper, you've got Rodriguez's name in parentheses, you've got a page number next to it, but I look down your list of sources on the works cited and you don't have a source with that author's last name as the first thing I see, then that's a significant error, because that tells me that either you used a source and didn't give proper credit for it, because you have to have both the works cited listing, the source listing, and the parenthetical citations in order to give proper credit. If you're missing one of those things, then you have a significant error that's going to be detrimental to your grade. So let's say that you have 2 sources with identical titles or identical authors' last names. And this happens a lot of times in English 101 papers, not as much in literature papers, but in English 101, sometimes you might be looking up something and have 2 articles with the same name. So here's an example of that. And this is how a works cited would look. The title of it is just works cited. Notice that it would be, if you were actually working at the top of the page here, this title would appear 1 inch from the top. And if this were an actual works cited, right up here, a 1/2 inch from the top would be your last name and the page number, which would be the last page of your essay. So here are my 2 articles. These are articles that were authored by the organizations that created the websites. So you have Dental Hygienists. Occupational Outlook Handbook is the name of the website. It's authored by the Office of Occupational Statistics and Employment Projections. So since they were both the author and the sponsor, they're listed just one time here. And then the date that this information was posted online, and the web address, the URL, and a period at the end. Now notice, this is what's called reverse indenting. See how the two first lines stick out, and they are aligned at the 1-inch mark of the left margin. And then all the lines after the first line of the works cited entries are indented in a 1/2 inch. So what that does is that makes it very obvious where one source ends and the next one begins. And it makes it really easy for the person who's looking at your material to tell how many sources you used and what they were. So the sources are put in alphabetical order based on the first part of the source entry that differs. So this is identical to this, and they both have a space next. And then hygienists is identical as well, and they both have the same period and quotation marks, and then they both have a space. So the first thing that's different is the O in occupational and the W in Wallace State. Now, since those are different, the O in the alphabet comes before the W. So this source is placed after this source, and that's how you decide that. So you want to make sure that you're putting the sources in alphabetical order, because the person who's grading your paper is going to be looking for that alphabetical order. And so that's going to be really important. You want to make sure that you take care of that and make sure all of your sources are in alphabetical order. So if the author's last names are the same, so if you have two authors that have the same last name but not the same first name, you're going to follow the same rule. You're going to start, this is a list of authors in alphabetical order. Now this is just the author's names, not the rest of the information about their articles or whatever sources they wrote. You have Sanders first, then Smith, because M comes after A. Remember, when we're alphabetizing, we look at each letter individually, and the earlier it is in the alphabet, of course, the earlier it is in the list. So Smith comes next. Now you have two sources that have authors with last names of Smith. So to decide which one goes first, you look at the very first thing that's different, which in this case is the A here at the beginning of this author's name and the R at the beginning of this author's name. So this author, A comes before R in the alphabet, and therefore Elena would be placed before Roderick in your works cited. And then notice you continue on and you have another S, and then U comes after M. So that's an alphabetical order list of authors' names. Now, it doesn't matter whether the sources are article titles or they are authors' names or editors' names. They are all mixed together. So here's an example of how to alphabetize a mixed list. One of the key things you want to note here is that articles A, an, and the are not included. So if an article title begins with A, an, or the, alphabetize based on the second word, not on A, an, or the. So what that means is, for this particular article, we're going to look at B because basics is the second word. Here we're going to look at C because career is the second word. So this is our first, this is B, C for career. then Sanders, Elena Smith, because her name starts with an A, Roderick Smith, because R, structural engineer, and then structural engineering. The reason structural engineer comes before structural engineering is because a space or no letter at all comes before having a letter. So there are extra letters in this title, so it falls later in the list than the one that comes before it. And then you end with Suarez comes after structural. So if an article title is almost identical to another article title, what should you do? Well, again, if you have a blank space, that comes before having an extra letter. So an article titled dental hygienist with just a T, one dental hygienist, comes before one titled dental hygienists, plural. So make sure you realize that when you are alphabetizing your materials. Parenthetical citations are the other part of a works cited and documenting an MLA. So the works cited is simply a list of all the sources you used in a paper. Parenthetical citations are the places in the body of the paper where you give credit to those authors whose work you used. So for a parenthetical citation, in parentheses, you typically put the last name of the person who wrote a source and the page number upon which the information you used is found. And you do that whether you summarized that material, paraphrased that material, or you just, quoted directly. If you quoted directly, you're still absolutely going to give credit. So when you cite, in parentheses, you're going to put the author's last name, the page number where you found the information. We're going to look at some examples of that in this handout. MLA doesn't require page numbers for online sources that aren't paginated. However, I want you to put those in. If page numbers aren't provided for a source, and a lot of online sources are formatted as PDFs or they're formatted in such a way they do have page numbers, but pretend you're going to print whatever the article is. You don't actually have to print it unless you want to. And then once you pretend you're going to print it, you're going to see what page number the information is on that you planned to use. So that way you'll have a page number. The idea here is you need to know where those page numbers go and how to format those parenthetical citations. So I want you to put those page numbers in. Do not leave them out. If you're citing a source that doesn't have an author or editor, use the title in the parenthetical citation. And if the title is long, use just the first noun phrase. You can ignore a, an, and the. Again, those articles, you don't use those for alphabetizing. You don't use them for parenthetical citations. So if the title of your article doesn't begin with a noun phrase, stop when you get to the first punctuation mark or at the end of the first phrase or clause. Here are some examples, and there are some additional examples available in the 9th edition of the MLA handbook. So here's an article titled An Examination of Grief. The parenthetical citation in your essay for that could just be examination in quotation marks and a 5 for the page number. So this is what you would put at the end of a sentence or a couple of sentences if you had summarized some information in your own words to show where you got those ideas. Here's another article, Learning to Navigate College. Learning is the first noun, and so you can use it by itself and put it in quotation marks and then put the page number. Notice these are your parentheses and the period goes after the parenthetical citation ends. We aren't going to be doing a poem or a play written in verse right now, so we're not going to worry about that, but if you ever should need to use that, and you would if you took future English classes, there's information in here on how to do that. If your source doesn't have an author and it has an editor, put the editor's last name and the page number in your parenthetical citations. And we've already talked about shortening the title of the source and using the title in parenthetical citations. And so you want to make sure that you match it carefully, except for AN and D, and we've already talked about that. In parenthetical citations, you don't put P for page or PP for pages the way you do in a works cited when you have an article, say, taken from the Alabama Virtual Library, for example. So when you put the number in that parenthetical citation, the reader, or in this case, your instructor, is aware that that's a page number. When you're formatting page numbers in parenthetical citations, if the page numbers have only 1 or 2 digits, include the entire page number for the last page, because you're going to put a range of pages. So for example, let's look at this first one. If you read some material from pages 2, 3, 4, and 5 of a book written by Smith, then you summarized some ideas you got from that material into 2 or 3 sentences. At the end of the last sentence that you summarized, you would include a parenthetical citation and you would put Smith's last name, and then you would put 2 through 5, which means the information you learned starting on page 2 and ending on page 5. If you had a citation for material starting on page 123 and ending on page 128, you would put Smith 123 through 28. You have to have at least 2 numbers if the pages are longer than a single digit. And then a citation for material starting on page 879 and ending on page 893 would look like this one. And a citation for material starting on page 698 and ending on 715 looks a little different, because the hundreds place number goes from being a 6 to being a 7, so you would need to add all 3 numbers in there instead of just the last 2. When you're putting down the page range for a source in your works cited, put the page number, page 6, and then formatting the page numbers for a source that's 2 or more pages long in the works cited, you would put PP for pages. Now that information is specifically for using in your works cited list. That's not for your parenthetical citations. So we're going to stop here and we're going to look at some examples in future recordings where we will talk about other parts of the MLA guide. Thank you so much.